All right, we have moved into the forest from space. Even pine needles. You smell the pine needles? That's not my deodorant, it's actually a pine needle track. Wow, nice. So, digital ethics. I'm going to be the moderator of this panel, and so I will try to actually not speak a lot. We do have a way for you to ask questions, so just please lift your hand and we'll pass the microphone around. And we picked the forest thing because it's a little bit of a topic where we can't see the forest for the trees, right? And the whole discussion about ethics is a complicated discussion. So we have three really great people here today. And they will briefly introduce what they stand for and what they do. Okay, we have John Havens, who will talk to us a little bit about his book and the work that he's doing. You see it over here, right? Aurelie Pauls, she works with the European Commission, Ethics Commission, and for a company called Crux. And then we have Amber Case, who's now at Berkman in the Center for Internet and Society. And this will be a very quick conversation. We're going to do a couple minutes each, and then we'll have a rapid-fire conversation about why ethics matters or why it should matter. And we're welcome to have you participate in this, okay? Let's get started with, I think you're first, right?
Sure.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amber Case. I'm studying humans and technology at Harvard, and I would like to begin by talking a little bit about the issues that happen when you have an interruptive society. So I'd like to talk about calm technology. Calm technology was a phrase that came out. Not sure what's causing that. We have an interruptive technology, like the interference in my microphone. And what we need is the opposite of that. We need a calm technology. A calm technology is where technology gets out of the way and lets you live your life. It's there when you need it and not when you don't. Could all of you hold up your phones really quickly? All right, great. So the faster you held those up, the more cyborg you are. Some of you are more reluctant cyborgs than others, but there is no division between humans and technology. It's part of our lives, and our lives are part of it. Our choosing each technology helps that technology reproduce, and that technology helps us live our lives. And this has been the beginning of time. The difference between humans and technology in the past and now in the future is that the shape and use of the technology has decreased. You could call it devices are larger on the inside than they are on the outside. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what happens over time. In the past, we had many people to one computer. You would go to a mainframe at another college or university, and you would have to book time on that mainframe. Then we had workstations and desktop computers before we had the web. You had everything near you. We weren't connecting to some remote thing. We would build software that was supposed to stay stable for 2 or 3 years without any updates. And then we got into the internet, and we got into what I like to call remote mainframes or the cloud, where you're still renting time on a server very far away from you. And now instead of many people to one device, we have many devices per one person. It's no longer that we're making technology that's meant to last for even numbers of years. We're making technology that gets updated and is unstable every 15 days or every 30 days, where all the data is outside of us, even our personal data, and when that gets hacked, we have to trust the many 30 or so networks that store that data for us. So if you start to process as much as you can on the device itself, and you start to look at things like distributed computing, you could share your information with a third-party provider for 24 hours or so for the purpose of adding that new information to your own database. That way, if somebody hacks into that system, they're only getting what has been shared by the users in the last 24 hours. It's not that we can prevent attacks, but we don't die because we get a cold. We have antibodies. So it's not like in the Titanic where it gets hit by an iceberg and the whole thing sinks. We need to have watertight containers between each of our departments so that we can actually not have these things sink our servers and really wreck our reputations. A lot of technologists try to make things that act like humans, If you've ever heard any of these disembodied computer voices that sound awful, or when you've been stuck in an automated parking garage because there's no humans around, the more automation that we get, the more important customer service is. Because, as Mark Weiser from Xerox PARC said, we're no longer living in a world that's based on desktop computers. We're living in a world where we're trying to download some software, where we're getting some sort of edge case, where we're getting into a zone where there's no connectivity all the time. And we don't have this kind of utopian future. We're not connected constantly. And when these things go wrong, we need to figure out backup plans. You shouldn't have to be a system administrator to live in your own home, and you shouldn't have your light switch. Can you imagine your lights turning on by going over to the web and then back? A lot of people have this right now, and that's a really big issue. I call it the new Schrodinger's cat. There was actually an automated cat feeder startup, and everybody trusted their cats to this service. The service would automatically feed their cat when they were away. But the service was connected to the web, and the web server went down, and no one knew where their cats were, and they didn't know if they were alive or dead. Now, we can consider this a kind of funny example of what can go wrong when we have the best intentions. But in reality, what happens if you have a self-driving car and there's no offline maps that have been downloaded, and the car doesn't know how to drive, and the network connection goes away because there's just not enough bandwidth, and you don't know where anybody in your family is, you don't know where you are, and you don't know how to get help. These are the issues that can come up. What happens if people forget to learn how to drive because there's an automated driving car? So for every new thing that we get, there's kind of a disfiguring of something that we had in the past. And so we have to be really careful about really doing engineering right. You would never build a house without having a licensed electrician check all of your wires because it's a fire hazard. And yet we have anybody making this technology without any checks and balances towards whether it's secure or not. There aren't a lot of these audits because they're considered expensive by companies. And it's not if, it's when these things will be hacked. So if good design allows people to accomplish their goals with the least amount of moves, a calm technology does that with the least amount of your attention. Part of digital ethics for me is that if you have so much attention that's always grabbing you, these different alerts, these different rings and dings, and always getting you out of being human, then isn't that getting in the way of you living your life? Isn't the most important thing being human? If we try to make computers that act like humans, we end up turning humans into things that act like computers. When I've been stuck in security between two countries, and I had a QR code on my boarding pass, and the QR code was bent, I had to find the nearest security camera and wave around until somebody could actually let me through. But if there wasn't a human there because we'd fired everybody, I would actually be physically stuck there, and no one would come and rescue me. So the only thing I'd be able to do, if there was any reception, is post a video to YouTube, have somebody call the airport, and then have them try to let me through. These are dystopian scenarios that I don't want to see happen, but will happen all the time unless we have humans in the loop. This is the idea of cybernetics, which came up in the 1940s. We don't talk about that term anymore, but it's a positive feedback loop that works in reaction to its environment. Instead of you don't just build a rhinoceros and put it out into a jungle. It doesn't fit into a jungle. But a lot of times we say, let's make some big technology with all the features, and then it doesn't work in relation to its environment. So the idea is that you have to evolve something slowly over time and see if people like it. There's a metabolism rate for how long it takes people to absorb technology. I just wrote a book called Calm Technology, which takes the principles out of Xerox PARC from the 90s and 2000s and talks about how we can make more ethical technology that conserves your attention and allows you to live your life instead of getting distracted by technology all the time. And I'll do a book signing on it after this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So if you have questions for Amber, note them down, but I have a brief question. In terms of a human being in the loop,
Yeah.
how would we actually do that today? It seems like basically technology is the loop everywhere, right? How will we get back to humans being in the loop? For example, in this crowd, If we use more technology, would we take ourselves out of the loop and automate it, or how exactly would we do this?
Oh, well, that's the funny thing. Most times, even though there's a lot of credit cards, we still have checks, we still have cash. There's kind of these backup systems. I think a lot of times technologists will say, let's redesign the entire website. And once you do that, you miss how the website has evolved in reaction to people. The best thing you can do is to call up your customer service department and say, what are the calls you're constantly getting every single day? Let's make it slightly easier for people to find that resource. Let's wait for 6 months. Let's do it again slowly over time until we get something that's really useful, because you don't want to replicate all the issues. There was a podcast about a technologist in San Francisco who went down to basically the train station, and he said, well, I want to automate all of these tellers who were giving directions. I want to automate the information booth. Everything should be on your phone, and you should be able to get your ticket passed through. And so the journalist said, well, can we go down to the station and have you tell that to the teller's face? Can you tell the teller herself, I want to automate you? And he said, sure. Walks downstairs. He's never taken public transit before. And he says, I want to automate you. You shouldn't exist. And the woman sits there and just laughs at him. And she says, this is ridiculous. How could you have everybody have a ticket on their phone? Not every phone will run the application. Not everybody has a smartphone. People from other countries probably don't have a global network that allows them to get access to data on the go. People have data limits. Also, people's phones might be out of batteries, and sometimes nothing's in the right language and you don't want to have to translate something.
But then again, maybe those things will be solved. We'll discuss later. Right?
But that's the thing, they aren't solved right now. They're
solved
solved by a person in the station who knows the context. And right on cue, 2 people from China came up and they said, hey, how do I get here? And she said, oh, I know a trick. Right? The computer is not going to be clever like that. And if it's a computer telling you something, oftentimes I see ticket machines where the ticket machine is down, you can't buy a ticket, the network's down, and you go to the teller, right? And the teller
smiles. A lot
of
companies argue exactly that they can fix this, right?
Right.
Probably quite a few companies in this room. We'll talk about that after we go to I think you're next, right? So John will talk about his new book, which is called Artificial Intelligence, and some of the key messages in the book and his work, right? So tell us briefly what you do, right?
Thank you. Good morning. How you doing? These are my last 3 books. I'm an author, a speaker, and a consultant. And I'm also working full-time as a consultant with the IEEE Standards Association. IEEE is the world's largest technology association, over 400,000 members. And I'm the executive director of a new program called the Global Initiative for Ethical Considerations and the Design of Autonomous Systems. So along the line of what Amber was just saying, and actually, can you go back, let's see, 1 slide. This, I think, oh, no, here we go. There, all right. Coffee's kicking in, there we go. If I was going to ask you this question, can you list me the top 10 values that drive your life? Do it in your brain. 10 values. If I had time, I would ask a couple people. And here's what happens when I do this. I'm like, what are the top 10 values that drive your life individually? And people go, oh, my family, work, cheese. I like cheese, right? It is hard to name 10 values that drive your life. But a lot of my work, my last book was on well-being. A lot what Gerd was talking about, happiness. But well-being, the empirical science of well-being is studying how when you take actions as a person, how your long-term well-being can improve or not. And we're with bankers and financial people. I wish I was better with my finances. But one thing I wonder is, most of you, if I walked around and said, how much do you have in your bank account, besides that being very rude to ask, you'd probably know down to the dollar how much you have. But most of us have not asked ourselves or our kids, what are the values of my life? So a lot of my work is convincing people that you can actually quantify your values. And I want to talk a little bit in my time today about a concept I have called values by design. So what you're looking at is with a nonprofit I ran a couple of years ago, a woman who's a PhD in positive psychology. We found this wonderful psychologist who had done this massive amount of research that found these 12 values that are common to all humans around the world. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone thinks of family the same way. It just means that around the world, family is a value that we all think about. So for 2 weeks, we had people take a survey, and at the beginning of the survey, we said, go through this list of 12 things. On a scale of 1 to 10, rate them. Give yourself a values life score. So for instance, nature. If you like being outside, you'd say, well, I guess nature's about a 9. Nature's an important value to me. And at the end of each day, we'd email you and we said, did you live to that value today? Because the science of well-being says if you don't live to your values, your happiness and your well-being decreases. Common sense. So say after 2 weeks, the person who said, well, nature's important to me, then we sent them back the data and said, well, every day you rated nature as a 1, which means you probably didn't go outside for that whole 2 weeks. And if that's a common sort of thread for you, maybe go outside. And what we were trying to show people is not to condemn them, but a lot of times the things that we think are most important, the things we think we value the most, we actually haven't tested. And I encourage you to test it. So first of all, in this era of algorithms, as Gerd said, it's just a fact. Very soon algorithms will know us better than we know ourselves. Outside-in tracking, at some point there becomes a break point where the things that influence your values also sort of take over your values. You need to track them. So part 1 of values by design is the individual. Second is the industry. So working with IEEE, one of the things that we've done in this group is we've actually got a standard project that's been approved, which we're very excited about in this group. And it's about taking this idea of what's called values-driven design and putting it into the design chain. So if you're familiar with waterfall techniques or agile for marketing, which you probably are, the logic here is in the same way I just talked about analyzing values. If we have algorithms that can tell what a person did 7 years ago, why can't we also use more rigorous applied ethical methodologies to know what your customers think about and what they value? So my colleague Sarah Speakerman, who wrote a wonderful must-read book called Ethical IT Innovation, this is a diagram from her book, and it's pretty simple. What you do is you ask very specifically, what do your customers think? What are their values? What's important to them at a granular level like I just talked about? And then you build your product or service for them, figuring out what are the value dams, what are the things that are blocking them from living the life they want to live. And you build around it. Build an extra switch, build more preferences. And now we can change how innovation is done in the algorithm economy. So values by design, part 2, I went from the individual to the industry. Now part 3 to wrap up is values by design for the algorithm. What you're looking at is an infographic from Wired magazine. A guy hacked the dating site OkCupid, and he said, I want to create an algorithm for me. And if you think it's weird to quantify your values, most dating sites ask for 400 individual pieces of data before your first date. You want a value life score? Sexual orientation, religion, what you watched yesterday, what type of cheese you like, 400 questions. That's a lot of data, algorithmic level picture of you. Should you own it? Yes. That's what this guy said. He said, this is too important. I'm finding my bride. This algorithm is me. In the digital and virtual realm, very soon my kids put on Oculus Rift. You live in virtual reality. You need to have a place to project your subjective truth, or democracy goes away. Foibles go away. The thing that one person about you they may think you're a jerk, but my wife, God bless her, she married me because of my foibles, the things that make me me. Cling to, claim, and project your digital, virtual values, right? We're getting tracked? Cool. Algorithms, thumbs up. The yes and is also make sure it goes inside out. So values by design, the individual, the industry, and the algorithm of you. Thank you very much.
All right, John, thanks very much. We'll talk more about this topic that we discussed yesterday in the pre-panel called data mining, which is about, with a Y, keeping data for yourself as a key asset. Let's go to Aurélie and see what she has to say. We're going to then move up to the stage, all of us, and take your questions and go to our discussion.
Super. Thank you very much. And as much as I love cheese, I miss it terribly living in Spain today. I basically wear two hats, and historically I come from the analytics world. So digitalization, measuring everything so that you can make decisions about it. And today I try to not become schizophrenic about the future, try to be positive about it, and wear two different hats, one for the European Commission, as Gert already announced, discussing digital ethics as part of a digital advisory group, where basically we talk about the notion of dignity and the fear of erosion of human dignity in a constantly increasing digitalized world. As the European Charter of Fundamental Rights first article talks about preservation of human dignity. So together with the European Data Protection Supervisor, we're trying to define what comes after the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, that is going to kick in May 2018, and define future-orientated rules and enforcements. What should come after the law? What should come in terms of ethics after compliance? And I would like to talk about that a bit. This means also this concept of dignity also means empowering individuals, data literacy, people understanding what happens with their data, how is it being shared, who has responsibility for that. And my other hat is I work for a data management platform out of San Francisco called Crocs, where basically we're creating data markets, buying, selling data, integrating data, profiling people, and where our role is basically to serve as accountable intermediaries for our clients, banks, financial institutions, publishers, marketeers from all realms of the world. Last but not least, where I actually sit is something called privacy engineering. I liaise between engineering teams, IT teams, legal counsel, security people, in order to make sure that we find the right balance related to ethical data uses and hopefully keeping up with human dignity one way or another. So what this means also that as I see privacy engineering, I see a lot of my clients talk about compliance. Are we fine in terms of compliance? Am I allowed to do this? From Australia to Switzerland, from China to Germany, is this okay? And what I'm seeing slowly but surely is certainly following the fact that there's a new legislation coming up in Europe called the General Data Protection Regulation, is that companies are trying to set up globalized or at least continental data setups, and they're moving away from this idea of pure compliance. Is this okay in Slovakia? Is not a question anymore. The question is going to be, what is the risk of me not being compliant? How can I factor in homogenized data setups to make sure that my risk of using data, this new asset, is going to be as cost-effective as possible and that I'm not going to be fined? And the best way to move beyond this idea of compliance is actually to embrace ethics. Be better than what the basis of the law asks for. Evolve and say, well, if Australia considers biometric data sensitive data 3 years ago, and Europe does the same, let's all agree that biometric information is sensitive data, and we should treat it that way. We should be very careful how we treat certain types of data. This means from a very practical perspective that we need to see how we use, for example, personal data, define personal data. What is personal data? How do we use sensitive data? How do we put data together? But also create those feedback loops that Amber and John were talking about in understanding scenarios in the use of data that could cause harm to individuals. How do we create those feedback loops and make sure that this goes back inside the engineering teams? Underlying that is, of course, security, encryption, also legal clauses in order to make sure that all this is balanced. So what we're seeing is an evolution of teams. We used to just talk to IT and marketing, for example, when we're talking about analytics. Now we're including legal counsel, social corporate responsibility as well. So I think it's really important to start thinking about not only purely compliance, but also risk and also understand how these different partners inside the ecosystem are going to align. See who has actually ownership of certain bits and pieces of data. What we're seeing is, even if we talk just about your websites or your applications, you're tracking a lot, you're measuring a lot, you're digitalizing a lot, but who actually owns these pieces of data are the questions that are going to arise. Because if we keep fighting between us about who owns the pieces of data, at some point, well, it's going to break. And what is happening today, from a pure compliance perspective, is that we're actually playing the blame game. It's inside my clauses. No, it's your responsibility. And we should move beyond that. We should move towards an idea of co-accountability, the idea of co-liability. And this is something that the Minister of Infrastructure in Germany also talked about when we're discussing the rules of responsibility and using Atomos robotic laws, for example. What happens if something happens to the car? Who is going to be liable? The Germans, being the Germans, they consider the manufacturer will be liable. But these are the discussions that need to take place today. Accountability, liability, co-ownership of the data. Who is going to take care of that? And we need to discuss that. Thank you.
Thank you. Stay there. All right, thanks very much. We're going to move up here because it's easier to take questions. We have, by the way, created a clever Dropbox folder where all the presentations will be in the Dropbox folder. My presentation will not be because it's basically video. You'll see that on YouTube. But the folder is called humanity.digital. That's the address, okay? Don't have to go there now. It's just a clever way to get into the folder, right? Can you move over a little bit? Humanity.digital. Okay? So after all the stuff you heard, this was a lot of information. Let's take a question from the audience if we have an urgent one. Okay, there's a couple of ones. Very good. Let's start right over here. I have a follow-up question. You can compile. We have about 15 minutes left, and keep twittering also.
My question is, you are discussing the future of technology. One path is algorithmic path, another one is humanity path. Take the example of a blockchain, which underlying technology is based on the hashing and asymmetric keys. The fundamental principle behind deploying the blockchain is the society, a trust deficit society. Therefore, we are going to implement a blockchain. So do you stop the technology going in the blockchain because the fundamental assumption of the technology implementation is a trust deficit environment? So what is the direction now? If you want to go to humanity route, we should not allow the blockchain to proceed.
That's a great question. I'm the moderator. I can't answer, so I'll pass this on here.
Does anybody? I'll take that. As an economics major, I believe in Nash equilibriums. So the fact that there must be a balance and that actors will not deviate from the norm. I think saying that not embracing blockchain is something where we should go towards is not a Nash equilibrium, because there's an advantage for companies to actually make use of this technology one way or another. So how do we make this together? So maybe.
Yeah, I mean, like Amber was talking about, and Aurélie as well, I think the data asymmetry issue is the big question, meaning blockchain I think is fantastic, but I want to be able to use it to create a personal cloud that's associated with my identity, where I don't think I'll own my data, but I have a copy of my data. There's a wonderful company in the States called Glimpse, Glimpse, and Life or Death, where people talk about privacy. Sometimes it's esoteric. This is a company that lets you go to all of your doctors, take all of their data, synthesize it, and then you can have a portable copy of your data to bring back to your doctors. So it literally is life or death, where you're saying this identity about my family's health is something I also want to partake in. But individuals have to have the same technology available to them, so there's not this massive data asymmetry where, again, algorithms are tracking. That's not bad or evil. But if an individual doesn't have sort of an IP level protection for the ownership or the categorization of their data, then this asymmetry means that the humanity doesn't have a chance.
Let me tag on. You want to answer on this?
Oh, I'm good.
Okay. Let me tag on a question to this. Right? We talk a lot about who's in control and who should ultimately, this is a big question, right? Is there such thing as a central control for these issues? Mission control for humanity, right? Menlo Park or wherever that's going to be. Or is it decentralized? Could control of these issues be a blockchain?
I'll take this one. Has anyone heard of the CyberSyn project? CYBERSYN. It was in Brazil. It was in the 70s. It was a big, completely closed control room that looked like Star Trek in terms of furniture. And the idea was that you could cybernetically control the entire city from there. Of course, the project didn't work out that well because it had no connection to the outside world. It was just based on these patterns that came in. So the project got scrapped. We don't really ever have a central point of control for anything. If something happens to your Facebook account, it doesn't go through one person. It might go through Facebook, but that's the person who's working there in the particular department at that particular time, whether they've had coffee or not, whether they're on maternity leave or paternity leave, and whether they can solve your issue, or whether you're friends with them on Facebook and they can change your account, or what the algorithm detects in your account. So I think the idea behind Bitcoin was so exciting because there was no central point of control at all. But when Mt. Gox got hacked and when these other databases were hacked and then the DAO thing happened, then the question was, who's really responsible? And I think that's the question that we don't have an answer for yet, right? So if you're in an auto accident, one person is responsible. If you determine, there's an eyewitness, this person's responsible, there's an insurance company that buy insurance. But if you're in a self-driving car accident, I think that it should be split up between, let's say it's a Google self-driving car, so Google would give you some sort of stipend, plus the manufacturer might give you something if it was due to some sort of defect in their car, which they would then need to budget for. Would the other person, well, no one's driving, right? So the question is, a lot of these times when you get hurt by third-party technology or a hack, no one is responsible. I hate to pick on Wells Fargo, but the amount that they paid for the breach of trust for their users was so small that it didn't mean anything. In fact, any bank could go out there and make fake accounts at this point and just pay a tiny little tax. So that's kind of more of an incentive than a disincentive to do it. At some point, in the 90s, the hacks were not really a big deal, but now they're getting to be more and more of big deals, and eventually it will be something that people have to really plan for and put a bunch of money aside to help the people out that are affected by them.
Well, control and trust are obviously related, right? I like to say that when you use control, when you should be using trust, that's a bad thing. But when you use trust, when you should be using control, maybe that's also a bad thing. Let me ask you about from your viewpoint, not representing the Commission, but talking about the European Commission, what is going to happen as far as Europe is concerned on this topic of control, of the data, of privacy, of the ethics? And is there any such thing? And a lot of people are telling me that essentially this is all theory, right? Basically saying that we cannot control, for example, what happens with artificial intelligence, right? This is all wishful thinking. Do you have any view on that?
Yeah, so from a very concrete perspective, what's clearly coming up in terms of responsibility when it comes to data uses is the General Data Protection Regulation that got agreed upon at the end of last year and kicks in May 2018. Mainly, if you want to think about your responsibility, the fines go up to 4% of global turnover or 20 million euros. So that's your stick right there. So your responsibility, that's going to be there in terms of how you manage data. Now that has passed, the big question is, how is this going to influence companies? And they're aligning their ducks slowly but surely. So we're seeing more questions in terms of security. We're seeing certifications. We're seeing audits. We're seeing privacy impact assessments. We're seeing a lot of questions coming in and also interlocking of liabilities between the different data actors.
But this is about data, right? Let's go to a larger question, right? Ethics is not just about data.
Yeah.
Right? So what if you build technology that's addictive? Facebook has hundreds of people who are building basically addiction into the model, right? So they're actually using neurological science to figure out how to get me to come back. and how to get them to stay as long as possible, right? And so is some of that use of making technology so powerful, who's going to decide if that's okay or not? That's like basically the mobile phone is the new cigarette, right? And the internet is the new religion.
Yeah, it's
Right?
the big discussion about what comes after compliance. What do we do now? How do we define how harm is being created, and how do we build the mechanisms to make sure that accountability is set through? I think building the basis of data protection legislation, security, now is the next steps that are coming up, the discussions we have. I remember American friends talking to me about data ethics 4 years ago. I was like, that's because you don't want legislation. You don't like legislation. I understand, I'm European, so it's perfect. But now this is really the next step after compliance.
Let's talk about the key point, John. We'll get you on that right away. Key point, key question I would have for John now is if data is actually the new oil, right? I think we all agree that data is the new oil, right? Do we need to regulate those that deal with that new oil? This is the question you were mentioning right now too, right? Do we need that? And if so, how would we agree on what it should be? Are companies that deal with data on those platforms going to be liable for what they're making us do, or allow us to do, or driving us, or manipulating us to do? Right? What do you think?
Sure. Yeah, of course people should be regulated. But I think, when you look back in history to things like seatbelts, I'm a dad, so I don't think seatbelts are restricting my kids' personal, ethics. But when seatbelts were first introduced, people freaked out. Like, no, I ride in the middle of the back seat and I go 90 miles an hour. And at that time, however, that was the zeitgeist. But now seatbelts, most people would not rail against their rights. I think one thing about the GDPR I wanted to point out, though, going back to the same question you just asked, though, is I rejoice in the GDPR. Why? Because it's comply or deny. Right? And by the way, I'm not saying I'm happy for companies having to go through struggle. That's not my point. My point is all the stuff that we're talking about, you have two kind of binary ways to go. One is, how do I do the least amount of work to get approved and not get fined? And, based on your resources, I'm not trying to say that that's a wrong thing to do. But now you also have to think about in the GDPR, there's another thing called a right to explanation. And the work that I'm doing at IEEE, a lot of the scientists are asking, if I build an effective robot, or if I build something, to your point, a bot online at Facebook, and someone says, to your point, Gerd, about using vocal technology, a lot of us are going to be not just talking to our machines, but saying, why did you do that? And they will have to answer back, oh, I did this. Well, I'm from China. That freaks me out. So the good news is you are now going to be, in one sense, companies, in a very positive way, all the work you're going to do to be compliant for GDPR, you can start to say, how do I listen that much better to my customers? How do I, as I mentioned before, understand their values? I have to do it anyway. I've been talking about privacy for 5 years and dignity and all the things that I so agree with everyone up here on stage with. That's all critically important. I was also an EVP of a top 10 PR firm, and Gillette and P&G, I couldn't go into meetings and be like, well-being, right? I had to go in and say, you are going to have to spend X amount of hundreds of thousands of dollars on compliance. While you're doing this, think about how can these tools on a data level listen to your customers, and how will this be the new green revolution? Because that's what it is. 10 years ago, the companies that said we have to protect the planet, now you have to protect humans. That's what the GDPR said. I didn't say it.
Good place to stop, John.
Build
Sorry.
innovation.
Sorry, protecting humans, that's a very good one. We have to unfortunately wrap up. I have a final thing I have to tell you about. I think we're pretty much done. Huh? I'm getting the nod here to get off. So what I would like to do is just get a final statement, short, like very short, like 1 minute from the three of you. And we're going to have a book signing session. I think, where's the books? I think right outside, right? So it's a book signing session. Unfortunately, my book didn't arrive, so you're going to have to actually buy it. But John has some books, and Amber has some books.
Nope, mine didn't arrive either, so you have to buy mine too. I'll
Okay,
sign
so
cards.
you'll have to sign the business card or something,
cards.
right? We'll have the signing session outside, and I'll make those quickly so we can think about the wrap-up, the wisdom. I would like you to think about one thing you want those people to remember when they go home tonight, the most important thing from this conversation about digital ethics. Give it a second. Okay, so here's some the next session is in Innotribe 12:45 for the fintechs Americans. And please rate the Future Show. No, don't rate the Future Show. No, just kidding. Digital ethics in the Sibos app. And of course, the Jimmy Monkey coffee is outside, whatever that is. I think you'd spend some money on that. And the social media thing. You all know about this stuff, so let's wrap up. And again, if you want to download stuff from us, it's humanity.digital. There's actually a domain called .digital now, which is strange, right? But I got one, right? So humanity.digital. Do you want to start?
You are worth tracking, meaning you are worth taking time to track your own values with or without technology, because pretty soon you won't have the chance.
Use a password manager and make sure you have a different password on every single site, because every month one of your sites that you clicked into through something and you signed up for a minute will get hacked, and you'll get on these lists. I'm part of a hackerspace, and we just go through these plain text files of people's passwords and credit card information all the time. If you've got one password, if you're using one password on something, chances are it'll have your first name, last name, password, address, everything you've put in. You can just use it on every other site. So don't do that. Use a password manager, and don't trust every third party, because there's no regulations around keeping your passwords out of plain text format.
And use that for your environment as well. So not just yourself, but also start teaching your children and the people around you about security, digital literacy, in order to make sure that we can all be secured and as happy as possible in the long term.
Well, great. My comment is embrace technology, don't become it. See you down the road. Thanks for coming. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you.